Hello, I'm here today with a review of The Proof of the Honey by Salwa Al Neimi. I guess the most important place to start with this review is to say that this is a novel. It's a work of fiction. There have been other reviews that have kind of speculated or even outright said that it's biography, but I think that that's all speculative. This is a novel. Salwa Al Neimi meant it to be a novel. It is a novel. Whether or not it's influenced by her own life or it's semi-autobiographical, that is something that one can certainly think about and read into the text that way, but to outright say that it's biography would be wrong. So this is a novel. Now, Salwa Al Neimi is a Syrian writer, and in this novel, The Proof of the Honey, the unnamed narrator is going through her own sort of not sexual awakening necessarily, but sexual documentation. She is documenting her account of her life sexually. For Al Neimi, who is a writer in the Arab world, obviously this is going to cause uproar, because not only is Al Neimi a woman who's writing about sex, but she also chose to write in Arabic. She chose to use a language that to most of the Arab world and also outside the Arab world is not a language that's used to talk about a woman's sexual desire or her sexual life at all. It's a language that's very connected to faith. And so Al Neimi definitely kind of breaks down quite a few boundaries, not only in writing the book itself, but in also choosing to write in Arabic. Obviously I read a translation, so I read it in English, but I can imagine that it caused quite a stir upon publication. It was actually banned from publication, although thanks to the internet, people have been able to acquire and consume this novel in places where it was banned. Now in the novel, the narrator, the woman who is making note of her sexual life, does so by reading and referring a lot to classical Arabic literature that is actually rich with sexual content. So reading these classical Arabic texts connects her with a history that has been sort of removed from the modern Arab world, or sort of downplayed, covered up, not really spoken about. Now back to what I said at the very beginning about maybe interpreting this as a piece of biography rather than a piece of fiction. It feels autobiographical. The narrator goes unnamed, and so it's very easy to insert Al Neimi in where that character is. It's easy to replace the two. And as she goes unnamed, there's also, it feels like a series of personal essays. Each section, which she calls gates, focuses on a different aspect of her own sexuality or sexuality in the Arab world. And because of this, there's no real linear plot. It's easy to read as a piece of biography or personal essays or memoir or anything like that. What's important is that Al Neimi and the narrator, are both talking about sex from an Arabic woman's point of view. In The Proof of the Honey, the narrator asks, is the scandal in the act or in the proclamation of the act? Talking about sex is what is important, but also what gets people riled up. You know, people know what happens, but it isn't until it's spoken about in the public sphere that it becomes like offensive or scandalous or just taboo. Later in the novel, the narrator says something kind of similar, which is, she says, to talk about sex is to indulge in it. Words are a component of sexual energy. So we can understand why talking about it is so powerful, because it contains sort of that intimate power. You know, you talk about your intimate, private world in public place, it can be kind of like unsettling. She gave an interview, Al Neimi, and she said that by focusing on old classical Arabic works of erotic literature in my literary work, I wanted to show that it is quite possible to write about sexuality and intimacy in Arabic. So it's obviously important to her as a writer, not just her narrator, but to her as well, to talk about sex, to bring it forth in her own language. In Shireen Al-Fekhi's Sex in the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, she talks about something similar to that. She says, "There is a long and distinguished history of Arabic writing on sex, literature, poetry, medical treatises, self-help manuals, which has slipped out of sight in much of the Arab world. Many of these great works were by religious figures who saw nothing incompatible between faith and sex. Indeed, it behooved these men of learning to have as full a knowledge of sexual practices and problems as they did of the intricacies of Islam. There is nothing academic about their writing. With surprising frankness and often disarming humor, these works cover almost every sexual subject and then some. There is precious little in Playboy, Cosmopolitan, The Joy of Sex, or any other taboo-busting work of the sexual revolution and beyond that this literature didn't touch on over a millennium ago." So she roots this sexual conversation, this Arabic sexual conversation, in history, in classical literature. And as most of you know, classical Arabic world is where we get so much of our literary tradition, science, medicine. I mean, that was the place. So it's interesting that she chooses to refer so closely to these texts, because it seems she knows that her literary work, The Proof of the Honey, would cause scandal because she's talking about sex in Arabic. But she's sort of saying, you know, we have a history of this. What are we so afraid of? When we were the world, it was okay. In The Proof of the Honey, the narrator talks about characters who are uncomfortable talking about sex in their own language, and so will choose to speak about it in other languages. They'll switch languages, they'll do a shift when they talk about sex to avoid using Arabic. "The funniest thing is that my friends resort to foreign languages when they want to use sexually explicit words. Obscenity is mitigated when spoken in a foreign language. The embarrassment they feel using those same words in Arabic evaporates. In English or French, they can pronounce any of them with the greatest of confidence." And Al-Fekhi echoes this in her work, in which she says, "Language also makes a difference. For some Israeli Arabs, Hebrew or English is a much more comfortable language for discussing sexual matters. When you say the word, to be able to say the word freely, it's 50% of the work," says one woman, a social worker. "Why do I choose to speak about a dick in Hebrew and not in Arabic? It must show something about my attitude towards things." So that's sort of interesting that the attitude towards sex comes through in language and use of language, and what they kind of shy away from. That's fascinating. Al Neimi closes the novel by echoing one of the first quotes that I read out, which she says, "Does the scandal lie in the deed or in the revelation of the deed? Who is asking the question? My story is no scandal, nor is my book. The scandal was in the secret, but the secret is no longer." Proof of the Honey, which is an excellent novel, and I suggest you all read it, is a powerful one, because Al Neimi is obviously going into it trying to dismantle the myth that sexuality doesn't belong in the Arab world, certainly not women's sexuality. And she tries to break down those walls by talking about it, and talking about it in Arabic, and sort of forcing her audience to think about women's sexuality in Arabic, in that language that is so close to them, that I guess would make them uncomfortable, but that's kind of how change comes about, right? So I definitely suggest reading this novel if you're at all interested in Arabic literature, or women's sexual politics, or really if you're interested in anything. It's great. So it's not so much a review as it is a discussion, this video, but I hope you liked it. It's definitely a great novel for conversation, so if you do read it, please come back and let's talk about it. So I hope you like this, and I can't wait to hear from you guys. Bye.